Welcome to the Economic Rockstar Podcast with your host, Frank Conway, connecting brilliant minds in economics and finance.
In this week's episode of the Economic Rockstar Podcast, I speak with Barry Eichengreen, Professor of Economics and Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Berkeley. We talk about the importance of economic history for the practicing economist, as well as whether we can learn from economic history and if history can repeat itself. Why the economics discipline suffers from academic schizophrenia, the problems of the IMF as an organisation today, and whether it can change for the better. We also discuss whether we can only have one reserve currency or if there is room for more than one, and what currencies would they be, whether Bitcoin meets the criteria to be regarded as money, and about Clarence Hatry and how he contributed to the stock market crash of 1929. You can check out all the links, books and resources mentioned in this episode over at the show notes page at economicrockstar.com/Barry Eichengreen, or visit economicrockstar.com/podcasts to access all previous podcast episodes. Thanks for listening and enjoy this episode with Barry Eichengreen. Economic Rockstar is a free podcast that does not exclude anyone from listening as long as they have a device to listen, download or stream. I have many listeners from all parts of the world, and I truly am pleased to know that the Economic Rockstar podcast unites all of you through the common theme of economics. I strive to commit to releasing an episode each week and aim to develop Economic Rockstar into much more than just a podcast. Patreon is a platform that gives you, the listener of the Economic Rockstar podcast, the opportunity to express your appreciation of the show by committing a financial reward for as little as $1 a month. Patreon allows me, the creator of the Economic Rockstar podcast, to be rewarded and paid by you so I can continue with the running costs of the show and to reinvest and expand the podcast into other platforms or mediums in the future. To find out more on how you can help the Economic Rockstar podcast and have your name added to the supporters list on my website, please check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/Economic Rockstar or visit the supporters page on the Economic Rockstar website.
He also underwrote municipal bonds of various sorts, and there was then in 1929 a scandal having to do with pledging the same municipal bonds against a variety of different loans that were made to his steel conglomerate. And Hatry's machinations are one of the famous supposed triggers for the stock market crash in 1929.
Barry Eichengreen is Professor of Economics and Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Berkeley, where he has taught since 1987, and Professor of American History and Institutions at the University of Cambridge. Professor Eichengreen is a Research Associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research and Research Fellow of the Center for Economic Policy Research. He has been a Fellow of the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Palo Alto and the Institute for Advanced Study in Berlin. He is a regular monthly columnist for Project Syndicate. Barry has authored and co-authored numerous books, including his most recent, How Global Currencies Work, Past, Present and Future, as well as The Korean Economy from a Miraculous Past to a Sustainable Future. His book, Exorbitant Privilege, The Rise and Fall of the Dollar and the Future of the International Monetary System, was shortlisted for the Financial Times and Goldman Sachs Business Book of the Year Award in 2011. Professor Eichengreen is the recipient of a Doctor honoris causa from the American University in Paris and a 2010 recipient of the Schumpeter Prize from the International Schumpeter Society. Hi, Frank Conway here, and you're listening to the Economic Rockstar Podcast. I am so honoured to have Professor Barry Eichengreen join me today. Hi, Barry. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Frank. Can I ask the first question, which is, how did you name your program?
Well, regarding doing a podcast itself, I wasn't sure in which direction I was going to go in, and it's only when I went to a conference and started speaking to attendees there that I realized that my conversation was more on economics, and it wasn't an economics conference. It was more general for podcasting. So I decided then it was going to be an economics-based long-form interview. And I just went for a walk with my dog, and I felt I shouldn't dwell too much on the title, and it just pretty much came to me. Maybe it was subliminal on recent work by Thomas Piketty, and they refer to him as an economic rock star on social media settings or something like that. So maybe it's somewhat come from there. So I just went with it.
Yeah, the title is perfectly fine. Economics and rock star are not two words that normally go together, however.
No, it's not, no. But maybe it's a fun way of creating a topic that might be eye-catching for people being introduced to economics, or non-economists who might want to find the show and look at something different. It's probably not the best title, but I ran with it anyway, and I don't know, it has put people off who decided to turn down requests to come on the show.
It does not. That does not appear to be a problem.
Oh, great. Okay. You're just after finishing a double lecture there, Barry, have you?
Yeah, we have a big undergraduate course called The World Economy in the 20th Century that I inherited from a now emeritus professor of economic history here at Berkeley, Albert Fishlow. He conceived of the course, and I've been very happy to teach it in his wake. It's kind of a combination of economic history and international economics.
Regarding the economic history, as we discussed pre-interview here, the importance of that type of academic endeavour, I suppose, I don't know what way you might say it, but do you find it very essential for economists to train in economic history?
It will not surprise you that I do make the argument that economic history is critical for the practicing economist. We have a required economic history course for all the PhD students here at Berkeley. Not all economic history programs do. We always have had such a required course. For a while, it was hard to convince PhD students of the importance of economic history, and you had to kind of win them over in the course of a semester. Now I think most of them are predisposed toward economic history. They understand that it can be an important part of their training. A variety of events in the world, from the transition in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, which pointed up the importance of history and institutions, brought that realization to the fore. The new growth economics has been important. The sources of modern economic growth are probably the single most central question to the literature in economic history. Recent work on inequality, you mentioned Thomas Piketty, has an important historical dimension. If you're a student of financial crises and concerned about the origins of the 2008-2009 financial crisis and whether similar things could recur, you're naturally driven toward economic history. I think there is finally a somewhat less intellectually defensible reason to do economic history, that it's a source of natural experiments. Economists are looking for natural experiments to solve their identification problem. So they're looking for times when historical borders were redrawn in order to identify institutional variation or political variation. They're looking for natural experiments, and therefore they look to history. That is not, to be clear, my preferred rationale for doing economic history, but it's another reason why plenty of people are being driven into the fold.
Given your work on economic history and how you delivered a module to your PhD students, do you see some similarities, or can you get a sense of what's happening today and the possible implications based on what you might have experienced in the past? I know things might change, but we are human after all, and we're quite fickle, and we perhaps never learn, and that kind of seeps into the economy too. Do we always make mistakes?
One of my motivations for studying economic history is the belief that the past can inform the present. an understanding of history and how things have evolved. History as a source of institutional variation. Both of those things are valuable for conceptualizing, for understanding better how to model and how to frame and how to theorize about current circumstances. I have put your point in somewhat different language than you did. In the past, people have put it in different language by saying things like history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. Mm-hmm. I prefer that formulation, I suppose. And one of my relatively recent books, Hall of Mirrors, about the financial crisis of the 1930s and the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, was about how the lessons people drew from that earlier crisis informed and framed how they responded to our crisis, both for the better and for the worst, but equally how experiencing our own crisis changes how we think about that history. So I think there is an interaction between past and present, but it works in both directions.
By learning from past failures, how can we improve the economy or even the safety net in terms of a social welfare setting? Or are we still failing in some of those cases? For example, I don't know, maybe the unemployment level and maybe the responses or the benefits or the transfer of payments, whether they exist there or not. Because, we have these images of the Great Depression where you have queues of people looking for work or turning up at soup kitchens, and we didn't really see that as much, even though in Ireland, where I'm based here, there had been, scenes of people queuing up for social welfare payments, and these are going, the queues are going a couple of blocks down, and that's all disappearing now and has disappeared, and we're enjoying now levels of something like 5% unemployment presently.
Yes, I think that history can constructively inform current policy, and sometimes it does. The way we responded to the banking crises that broke out in 2008, 2009 was importantly informed by the policy mistakes of the 1930s. People observe that Ben Bernanke is a student of the Great Depression, and the Fed responded to the banking crisis in the U.S. in 2008 much better than it had responded in 1931-33, partly because some of the relevant policymakers were students of that earlier history, and partly because the institutional arrangements today have been reshaped to reflect the lessons of that earlier history and the policy mistakes made 80 years ago. At the same time, I would observe that history can be a set of blinders in addition to being a lens through which to see the present. In 2008, we missed the crisis in the shadow banking system. I would argue partly because there had been no shadow banking system of any significance in the 1930s. Students of the 1930s studied the banking crisis as a result, and they didn't have as much consciousness of problems in derivatives markets and shadow banking more generally until it was too late. I also think it is entirely possible to unlearn lessons of the past. My own view is that some of the important neo-Keynesian wisdom that we had been teaching our students toward the end of the 20th century got lost in the early 21st. That governments went too far in the direction of austerity and aggravating unemployment problems where they had room to do otherwise. So that's a reminder that being able to distill lessons from earlier history is no guarantee that that history will be remembered.
And I have a couple of questions here now based on what you were just discussing there. And just in case I forget, is it okay to ask the two even though they're unrelated?
Go ahead.
And you can choose one or, yeah. It's just regarding economic history. What if there has been a situation like, for example, Brexit, that I don't think there's any union there that has broken down. Perhaps maybe imperialism, where we had the likes of the end of the imperialism and the states, or likes of Hong Kong transitioning over from Britain to China or as a main independent country. But is there anything from a historical perspective that we can kind of tell what's going to happen to Britain, or is this just uncharted territory?
Well, I think every modern economic event or episode has an uncharted territory aspect to it, in which case history is useful for pinpointing what is different this time. You mentioned Brexit. Let me instead, because it's something that I've worked on, talk about Brexit, namely the possibility, much discussed in recent years, that Greece or another country in its position might leave the euro. I think the euro area is an unprecedented construct, and that the analogy I use is like Hotel California. You can get in, you can check in, but you can't check out. Getting out of the euro area, Ireland has been through this discussion too. A decade ago, getting out would be incredibly disruptive and damaging to the economy, so you've got to make it work. That's very different than the gold standard, when a historical analogy that people often use, when countries retained their own currency and all they had to do was change its value, which was easier than the problem for a Greece or an Ireland today, which would be to reintroduce a non-existent national currency. So understanding that difference, I think, points you toward what is distinctive about current circumstances, and you need to understand the history in order to be able to identify the difference.
The other question I was thinking of was regarding austerity and how far back, in terms of our economic growth or economic progress, how damaging do you think that could have been to us for those Western countries, or every other country that could be some way indirectly affected by, in terms of trade and prosperity and equality?
I don't know if I can give you exactly how damaging answer, but I think with the passage of time, there is an accumulation of evidence that governments went too far too fast in the direction of austerity. This was certainly the case of countries like the United States, which unwound the Obama stimulus quickly starting in 2010. This was certainly the case of the UK, which went hard in the direction of austerity under Chancellor Osborne. And I think it was basically the case also of countries like Ireland that didn't have their own currency. Going too far, too fast in the direction of austerity did make unemployment higher than it needed to be, and did make the recession deeper than it had to be. And given the way government spending was cut, made the inequality problem worse as well. There are political tensions all across Europe and in the United States as a result, I think, of those decisions, which were driven more by political arguments, I think, than economic arguments.
And one thing that tends to be overlooked, I suppose, in research on economics, and maybe not in terms of articles that are written, are the personal effects, or the well-being effects, I should say, the psychological effects of austerity on people.
I don't know that I agree with the proposition in general, but I do think that there is a bit of intellectual schizophrenia in economics, in the discipline of economics, and that we swing from neglect of those social and psychological and personal aspects at some points in time to close attention to them in others. It was certainly the case before the global financial crisis that people forgot the basic fact from international economics that globalization and free trade does not automatically raise all boats, that it does not automatically benefit everyone. And then once backlash against globalization developed for entirely predictable reasons, when the people who had been left behind became alienated from globalization and from the political establishment, we again began to pay close attention to the social and psychological and health-related problems that the left-behind folks experience. So for me, the mystery it remains not too different from what you asked, Frank, why the economics profession suffers from these episodes of collective amnesia where, we teach the Stoper-Samuelson theorem that free trade benefits the abundant factor of production, but it hurts not only relatively, but absolutely the scarce one. Why we forget that when times are good.
Barry, you were a senior policy advisor at the IMF from 97 to 98. How do you view the role of the IMF today from the outside, given the events that has happened since 97 or 98?
The IMF is a work in progress, and it will always remain a work in progress. It is continually reinventing itself to be relevant to current circumstances. Some people would dismiss this as the fund simply being a bureaucracy in search of a mission. But I do think it is trying to adapt to meet current circumstances, which are circumstances of where there are threats to financial stability, where there are questions about the architecture of the international monetary and financial system, where there are important tensions emanating from the rise of China and the isolationism of the United States. I do think that the fund's current management is navigating these waters pretty well, but they haven't resolved problem number one, which is their governance problem, that the U.S. retains a veto over important policy decisions, an inheritance from the post-World War II period, and important emerging markets, most notably China, are underrepresented in the fund. So I think until those problems are redressed, and more generally there is a solution to problems of IMF governance, the fund is going to continue to be of questionable relevance, and it will continue to be criticized and attacked. If you want me to go on and tell you what I would propose for IMF governance, I have a specific idea, which is that the IMF should be remade in the manner of a central bank monetary policy committee. The problem the fund faces is that it is subject to political pressures, and so it cannot make time-consistent policies, and its decisions are distorted by political pressures. Probably the best example of this would be the Greek program in 2010, when the IMF wanted Greece to write down its debt as part of the first loan program. But the Europeans, collectively powerful shareholders in the fund, said, we don't want a debt write-down because Greek debt restructuring will bankrupt French and German lenders. So the fund had to back down and couldn't proceed with what it thought was appropriate policy. Now imagine that instead the fund would make that the fund management, meaning the managing director and a group of deputy managing directors, maybe 7 in number, like a monetary policy committee of a central bank, could decide whether to lend to Greece or not and under what conditions, and wouldn't have to bow to the wishes of European shareholders. I think it would make better decisions for the crisis country, better decisions for the world, better decisions for the IMF. We've seen the wisdom of delegating such decisions to independent monetary policy committees and central banks. I think that would work for the IMF, subject to some provisos as well.
I absolutely agree. We recall the situation from 10 years ago. A lot of the losses were pretty much made public, so they privatized the gains essentially and made losses public. And we've seen that in say, for example, in Ireland, where we were encouraged to burn the bondholders, but never did. And we bailed them out using tax money and the government raiding the pension funds. Whether that was the right decision, who knows?
Right. In Ireland, you received the Trichet letter from the European Central Bank, which basically instructed you not to burn the bondholders. And I think there was similarly tension between the European institutions, as they are called, and the IMF. An independent IMF would have presumably recommended a different course.
Yeah, that's interesting. Earlier on, you referred to the tensions regarding the rise of China and also the isolation of the United States. Would you mind elaborating on what you mean by that?
What I really mean is that the U.S. has been the leader of the process of constructing a set of global institutions, from the International Monetary Fund to what is now the World Trade Organization, for the last 60-plus years, ever since the end of World War II. And there are signs of the U.S. abrogating that leadership, turning away from the WTO, certainly, turning away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, turning away from the Paris Climate Accord. There's a famous view of the Great Depression that I associate with the MIT economic historian Charles Kindleberger, which says global stability requires a leader, a hegemonic country. That was the United States for half a century after World War II. Now, two things have changed. Number one, the U.S. is no longer so important as a player in the global economy, as an economic force. And number two, it's no longer a reliable political force, given the peculiar political things and the peculiar political leadership we have in the U.S. So who is going to step up to fill those shoes? It could be China with its Belt and Road Initiative and its Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, but we don't exactly know what agenda the Chinese will seek to advance as they exercise more leadership globally. We don't know whether China, which is still a smaller economy when measured at market exchange rates, which is what's relevant for international transactions, China is still smaller than the U.S., whether it has the capacity to build global institutions and stabilize a potentially unstable global economy. So a lot of people are worried about how long this changing of the guard could take. It arguably took a quarter of a century for the changing of the guard from the UK to the US to occur in the first half of the 20th century, and an awful lot of instability intervened. That is what people are rightly worried about today.
And would you think people would be worried about a dominant China in terms of the global reach it could have across Asia and Africa and maybe into Europe?
Of course people are worried because they don't know what Chinese leadership's agenda will be. China is not obviously interested in spreading democracy and fostering human rights and doing other things that we have come to associate with, or we had come to associate with U.S. leadership, or that are part of Europe's acquis communautaire. So they are worried about the implications, not only economic, but social, political, and human.
Your recent book, How Global Currencies Work, Past, Present and Future, And I think this is a nice lead-in from what we were just talking about there regarding China and the US and also the UK. And we had reserve currencies, the British pound, the US dollar, and then, as you mentioned, perhaps someday the Chinese yuan in your book. Is there room for more than one reserve currency? Or will we see a dominance of the yuan or maybe the maintenance of the US dollar as a reserve currency?
The central argument of the book is that there is room for more than one, that there is an old view of international currency status and a new view. From the language, you can guess which view I associate myself with. But the old view is there's only room for one, that network effects are so strong that everyone has an incentive to use the same national currency for cross-border transactions that other people are using, and that the dominant currency, therefore, crowds out the rest. Once upon a time, that dominant currency was the dollar, was the pound sterling. Now it's the dollar, and in the future it may be China's currency. We, meaning my co-authors, Arnaud Mel and Livia Chitu, and I, argue for a new view in which network effects are not all that strong, where it's easy to switch between national currencies in different international transactions. Just like it's much easier today to move data across different platforms or operating systems for personal electronics than it was 20 years ago. So multiple national currencies can play an important international role. In my earlier work, I'd argued that the plausible candidates were the dollar, the euro, and the Chinese renminbi, the other name for that Chinese currency. In this book, we are more bullish about the euro because the European economy is recovering and the European banking system is stronger than it once was, and because Mr. Macron is attempting to drive the process of European integration and institution building forward, we're more pessimistic about the Chinese currency. The observation being that every leading international and reserve currency in history has been the currency of a political republic or democracy, starting from the Republican city-states of Venice and Genoa and Florence, going through the Dutch Republic, the United Kingdom, the United States. Not so China, that people want to be sure about the existence of checks and balances on the arbitrary exercise of action by the executive. They have those in a political democracy. They're not sure that they have them in China. And China may be moving in precisely the wrong direction from the point of view of making its currency a leading global currency by centralizing power in the hands of one person.
I was going to ask, you don't have to answer this actually, but if the Chinese were to ask you for advice regarding what they should do to carve out a path of creating the yuan renminbi as a reserve currency in the future, what would you advise them to do? Would it be coming from maybe the political stances you said, or more of a democracy and openness?
Well, on the political side, I think the answer is additional institutional reform, a very important symbolic step that, interestingly, nobody is talking about, would be to make the central bank independent. That would give investors confidence that monetary policy and regulatory policy were being made on the basis of economic advice and objectives rather than Chinese political objectives. On the more narrowly economic and financial side, it's important to build deeper and more liquid financial markets. In 2015, they went through an episode of high volatility where people were doubting the stability of financial markets, and the Chinese stock market went on a roller coaster. To continue to do what they're doing to strengthen the institutional framework for their financial markets and enhance the liquidity of those markets would be important. But they have to recognize that doing so is a long-haul and that they have to keep at it for a decade or two before it's safe to fully open their financial markets to the rest of the world.
And you mentioned that technology, in this book, you mentioned that technology is a key factor in terms of creating that reserve currencies or being able to allow multiple currencies to operate at the same time. With these new currencies, I suppose they are currencies, the cryptocurrencies, regarding the blockchain, how do you see the evolution of blockchain or cryptocurrencies in the future? Are they here to stay, really?
I'm skeptical about any of the current cryptocurrencies being here to stay. So I think about money like all economists do. It has a means of payment, a unit of account, a store of value function. And global currencies have those functions for cross-border transactions. Bitcoin, to pick an example not entirely at random, is not a convenient means of payment, at least given the current technology. It's not a stable store of value, so therefore nobody uses it as a unit of account. It's not backed by anything in particular except utility people attach to anonymity. And the anonymity is problematic for authorities who want to prevent money laundering and tax evasion and terrorist finance. So will it be allowed to stand? I don't know. That then leaves central bank issued digital currencies, where again, whether anonymity is going to be preserved, I don't know. Something akin to blockchain might be used for those central bank issued digital currencies, but I think there are real questions about how a central bank backed digital currency would work. Would the Bank of Ireland permit you to open an account with it just like it permits the big banks to do so today? Would everybody have an account with the central bank? Would everybody have a smart card in their wallet that they can load up with central bank digital currency, and how would that work exactly? I think there are big things to be sorted out before we get there.
Barry, I came across your work, I think it was back in 1997 for the first time as an undergrad student. And just prior to this conversation, I became quite overwhelmed by the amount of work that you've done in the period since 1997. And I'd just love to find out, how did you get into economics initially and your transition toward working on currencies and looking at the history of economics too?
I got into economics partly by process of elimination, that I had an interest in history and the social sciences, in political science and anthropology and sociology. I found all those other subjects difficult because they didn't have enough structure for me to be able to get my mind around them, or they simply opened up too many possibilities. Economics had a set of models that you could, like training wheels, that you could use to begin to analyze and understand problems. So I found doing economics more comfortable, more satisfying than doing sociology or anthropology or political science. And once I started to do economics, I could dabble a little bit in those other fields as well. So that's one answer. Another answer is that I had a couple of very good teachers who turned me on to economics and economic history. I had a close childhood friend who is now a well-known academic economist. So by interacting with him, he discovered economics a little earlier than I did, but communicated his interest to me. All of those were factors. And then there's happenstance. I was an undergraduate at the University of California, Santa Cruz. They had a meeting in the final year of studies where economics undergraduates could go and hear ideas about what they might do with their degree. And one professor said, well, you could go to Washington, D.C. and work. And I thought that sounded interesting. He tried to set me up with a research assistant job at the U.S. Department of Labor, but his friend didn't write him back. So then, embarrassed as he was, he called up a colleague at the Brookings Institution who had an opening where I got hired, and one thing led to another. So it was partly being surrounded by really interesting, policy-oriented, top-notch economists at Brookings for a year, and that got me into graduate school. Graduate school got me into an assistant professor job, and one darn thing led to another.
If you could travel back in time, what era would you like to go back to? Who would you like to meet, and what conversation would you think you could have with them?
Now you're switching gears.
Yeah, well, we're still on history.
Okay. Maybe. We do that. I guess my PhD dissertation was on Great Britain in the slump in the 1920s and 30s, and I have never succeeded in getting away from that. So I would go back to the UK in the 1920s and 30s, and my obvious first stop would be Cambridge and King's College and John Maynard Keynes, who not only was a great economic theorist, but a character, a personality. I remain interested in correspondence between and the thinking of the two great central bankers of that period, Montague Norman in the UK and Benjamin Strong in the US. There's great correspondence between the two about how they perceived current problems. So they did think out loud about those things, although they only committed part of their thoughts to writing. They also went on holiday together, where I'm sure they talked about monetary policy. And finally, there was crazy, disreputable entrepreneur in the 1920s, Clarence Hattrey. Have you heard the name?
I haven't, no.
So he started out, he inherited his father's silk hat making business, but he turned into a bit of a financier and an entrepreneur, and in the 1920s tried to buy up the entire British steel industry and reorganize it. He also underwrote municipal bonds of various sorts, and there was then in 1929 a scandal having to do with pledging the same municipal bonds against a variety of different loans that were made to his steel conglomerate. And Hattrey's machinations are one of the famous supposed triggers for the stock market crash in 1929. There's a big, there's no agreement among economic historians about whether Hattrey was honest but excessively ambitious, or whether he was devious and dishonest in his financial maneuvers, something we're going to be able to determine only by talking to him.
Yes, I was just going to say those questions you're posing, that'd be a great way for somebody to try and answer them. But I doubt he's left any journals behind that people could research and find out exactly what his motives were, if there were motives in terms of dishonesty, or was he just 100% honest and you had a failure there. It's just interesting to hear of these kind of people back in the past, and to be honest, it'd be nice reading, a nice book to read if you could gather individuals like that together.
That's what historians do. They often have to try to piece together actions and motives from scattered evidence. I will put it on the list.
Yes, and recently, actually, a historian, Susanna Lipscomb, she's based in London, University in London, and she's written a book on the women of Nimes in France, and looking at I think it's 100 years, a couple of hundred. It's a historical book anyway, and again, looking at those social aspects, and I'm sure within that, you could pick out economic themes as an economist, or anybody really who's in tune with any aspect of economics, looking at historical books from a historical context. And it's nice to see a book like that just focuses in on one particular town or a group of individuals that may not be related, but their actions are somewhat relatable.
Yeah, there are a number of productive approaches to doing scholarship of this sort. There are a series of books on particular years in time. There are a series of books on particular commodities, from cotton
yes.
to cod to sugar to salt. So, historical scholars have a variety of different approaches or models to doing this kind of work.
Barry, can I ask you another couple of questions that are somewhat independent from what we were talking about?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'd like asking my guests if they had any writing tips that you could share with us.
Writing tips. Number one, read critically. Find someone whose writing you admire and try to figure out what makes it work. Number two, keep it simple. So this is a lesson that I learned from my friend and MIT colleague Peter Temin, that shorter declarative sentences are better, and you can always make them shorter and more declarative. Number three, revise. That no sentence or paragraph is perfect or even adequate the first, second, third, fourth, or fifth go round. And fourth, practice. That one's writing tends to get better, or at least I hope so, the more of it you do.
Do you find yourself repeating the same type of habits when you need to sit down and write? For example, I don't know, is there a time of the day? Do you have to block out noise, or are you someone who likes working in a place where there is that type of activity?
Yeah, I do better when it's quiet and when there are fewer distractions. So I tend to work at home early in the morning and try to avoid my email until I've spent some time writing. I can only really do serious writing at my desk, in my study, at home. I describe in an earlier book, Exorbitant Privilege, about how that book coincided in time with a home renovation project we did where we replaced the kitchen and added a room to the house. And the workers kept arriving earlier and earlier in the morning, forcing me to get up even earlier.
That is a very good way of trying to get you up early and start writing then, yeah. I also, since we're on the topic of books here, Exuberant Privilege and the many other books that you have available, and I'll put the link to your own webpage where people can actually go through those and click in and read more about your books. But do you have any recommended books you'd like to share with us?
My recommended book is almost always the most recent book I've read, but this one is not only recent but very highly recommended. James Scott, who is historian and anthropologist at Yale, has a recent book called Against the Grain, which has the merits of being short, being beautifully written, and being very original. It's about the transition from hunter-gatherer society to settled agriculture, about whether settled agriculture then gives rise to the state as a way of defending and protecting sedentary citizenry. That's in 20 words the way many people teach 10,000 years of history. And as an anthropologist, he uses anthropological and archaeological evidence to shoot holes in that conventional wisdom. So it's about 250 pages of very thought-provoking, beautifully written history.
Nice. Is there a song that you could identify any economic themes that we could listen to it in a different type of way, being tuned into some type of economics? A
song with economic themes, I'm not sure I can do the one I listen to a lot of instrumental music. So
even going back to the 1920s or something, is there anything, the way the musicians have lyrics?
We're going to have to post the answer to that one to your website when I come up with it.
Yeah, this is only a new question, and I should have put it to you in an email. Interesting that I kind of like to explore in a way, because it's interesting for maybe students of economics to relate books or songs to economics.
Yeah, so in my teaching, I use a variety of materials from YouTube videos of speeches and of famous scenes in movies. I should use music, which I don't.
Okay, and what about a movie then? Do you have a movie that you could recommend with economic themes?
Oh, I am about to show my undergraduates some scenes from It's a Wonderful Life with the bank run.
Yes.
Scene to try to help them understand financial crises and the financial environment in the U.S. in the 1930s.
I think, it's just one more question then, just a general question. Is there anything that you'd like to leave us with in terms of advice or guidance or anything like that for any economist or aspiring economist?
Well, I think looking not only at the theoretical literature, but reading widely about not only about the economy, but about society is important. People said to me when I was studying to be an economist, there are those who read and those who write, that you can't really do both. I think that's wrong, and that even if you do economic history, you can draw a lot of your inspiration about what historical themes or events to study from current events. So I'll leave you with the following example, that we had Brexit and we had the election of Donald Trump, which gave rise to a lot of discussion about populism. I wrote actually a newspaper column comparing Donald Trump with William Jennings Bryan, the populist presidential candidate in 1896, after which I thought I should go back and see whether my assertions about the parallels were correct. And I found there was no study of the 1896 election that looked at voting patterns and at the importance of identity politics versus economic grievances. So off I went with some collaborators to do that study. That's an example of how current events can inform economic scholarship, can inform historical scholarship. And for me, it's a reminder of the importance of reading.
For people who want to read more about you, where could they find you?
You can find me on my University of California, Berkeley economics website. I think most conveniently and completely, you can find me on Project Syndicate, and you can find me at Ideas.
Professor Eichengreen, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. I really enjoyed it, learned a lot from you too, and it's been an absolute privilege to sit here in conversation with you. And if you don't mind me saying this, you are an economic rock star.
I'm not sure I'm going to accept the label, but I enjoyed the podcast.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thanks, Frank. It was fun for me as well.
If you enjoyed this podcast, why not leave some feedback or comments on the show notes page on economicrockstar.com, where you can also sign up and be a member of the Economic Rockstar community. If you're listening to this episode on iTunes or Stitcher Radio, I would love to have some feedback and for you to leave an honest rating and review, as this will help with the rankings of the show so that more people can find it. If you're listening on the website economicrockstar.com, make sure you check out the back catalogue of all previous episodes and interviews with some amazing professors and authors at economicrockstar.com/podcasts. Thanks for listening, and I really appreciate your loyal support. I know how much you love audio, so why not get a free audiobook with Economic Rockstar today? I've teamed up with audiobooks.com to bring you this amazing offer. Visit audiobooks.com/rockstar to download your free audiobook now.